An unexpected perk of this job is getting to see some really lovely fossils. The Late Ordovician, the latter part of the Ordovician at least, was an incredibly rich and interesting time in the history of life, and a box of rocks just sent to me shows exactly how diverse it really was. Hello everyone, and welcome back. Or for anyone who is new here, welcome. I'm Joe Botting. I'm a paleontologist by background and still working and publishing papers in the interesting part of the fossil record, the really old stuff, mainly Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, that sort of time. And on this channel, we cover a whole range of things, mainly dealing with the earlier part of the fossil record, but also delving into anything interesting that turns up from other ages as well. So it tends to be deep dives into things like news stories where you might have seen their headlines, but do you actually understand the paper? So we take sort of a really close look and an unbiased look. We try to work out what we actually believe from what has been published, what is plausible, and what might have gone a bit wrong, all that sort of stuff. But we also look at the modern processes of paleontology. We go and do field work at times, and we look at rocks as well. So we have wonderful microscope setups where I can show you what's here down the microscopes, and you can end up seeing the whole range of the fossil record that we can get into this field of view. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, please do subscribe, like, and stick around and make comments and join in our wonderful community, because there are a lot of dedicated people that I'm very lucky to have watching these videos and contributing in the comments. Stick around. So today we'll be looking at a box of rocks that has been lent to me by Andrew Cox. When I say a box, I mean a big box. And there's a lot of fossils in a box that size. Now, Andrew is an incredibly good collector and has been working for many, many years in the Welsh borders and Shropshire especially, and has an extraordinary collection of fossils. I've only seen photographs of things, but they are amazing. He focuses a lot on trilobites, but all sorts of other stuff as well. So it's quite a luxury to be given a chance to look at some material from one of his sites. And this is a new site. Apparently he hasn't even spent any time looking at this yet. He collected it and then sent it to me a couple of days later, just to see what I can make of it. And it is extremely rich. There is a lot of material here. You can see it's sort of slabs of rock with the surfaces covered in fossils. Yes, you'll get a closer look in a minute. The rocks are from the Harnage Shales of the Late Ordovician of Shropshire. And so there's a wonderful opportunity here to compare with what I was looking at in a previous video when Gary Hoare gave me some rocks from Scotland from the early Silurian, because the latest Ordovician was the second biggest mass extinction in history. And we are looking at relatively similar sort of fauna, siltstone, mudstone, sandstone type sort of faunas, living around the coasts of actually two different continents at this time, but still there was only one ocean between us. And you can see how the diversity patterns, the faunas have changed between this and then the mass extinction and then the rough nuke quarry. So do have a look at that other video as well, because it's quite instructive, I think, even with this little cursory look that we can do in an hour or so. So this is from before the end Ordovician mass extinction. But more than that, it is from the peak of the Ordovician diversification interval. So the Harnage Shales are from what used to be known as the Caradocean. That's the old British terminology for the rock layers. And it is now included within the Sandbian, so the earlier part of the Late Ordovician. Specifically within the Caradocean, it's the Barelian stage series, one of those, from around 455 to 456 million years ago. We've got it fairly precisely known because this is a classic area of geology and the stratigraphy has been well done for a century or so. We also know that this is in the Diplograptus foliaceus biozone, which is very close in age to the rocks I'm used to around here in the Builth Llandrindod Inlier of central Wales. In fact, the foliaceous biozone overlies the gracilis biozone, and the youngest rocks we have are going into the gracilis biozone. So it's only maybe 1 million years or so, maybe 1 to 2 million years after the end of the interval that we're looking at in the rocks here. It's not that different in location either. We're just 40 miles or so down the Ordovician coastline. That may not be quite accurate because there has been faulting along this sort of region, and it's possible that these bits have been brought closer together or even pushed further apart than they originally were, but probably it's not enormously different in location. This is the sort of distance that records ecological differences rather than geographic ones. So any differences in the faunas that we are familiar with here compared with what we're seeing in these new rocks from Shropshire are likely to be due to differences in the preference of the environmental habitats that things lived in rather than difference in the ranges that these species inhabited. So if they were still alive at the same time, and some species definitely were, so Diplograptus foliaceus itself, this graptolite that defines the biozone, we have in the Builth Inlier. It already existed, and then it carried on through this later time and became the diagnostic fossil for the age of the rocks that we're looking at there. So this species at least, and probably many others, did live at the same time as the ones we're looking at here. 1 million years is a sort of average lifespan of a species through geological time. So many of them will have lasted longer, some will have been less, but there would have been a lot of overlap in time. Does this all mean that the species are going to be familiar to me? Yes, and mainly no. The age difference might be significant because at this time life was diversifying at a spectacular rate. It is, in fact, in the peak of the Great Ordovician Biodiversification event. This was an interval that I'll go into in detail at some point, where life was diversifying spectacularly at low taxonomic levels, so at species and genus. There were new ones popping up all over the place, all over the world, particularly at this time in the early part of the Late Ordovician and the later part of the Middle Ordovician. So we're in this phase of massive diversification, and so there will be many more species that evolved during that 1 to 2 million year age difference. But that's not the main thing. The critical difference is environmental. So out here in the middle of Wales, we were in the basin. We were around a volcanic island system that was offshore from the continental margin. Sorry, not the continental margin, the continental coastline. So what we have here is a very different ecosystem from Shropshire, where it was living actually around the shorelines and the shallow shelf associated with it. You might expect there to be a lot of overlap in the species that were occupying similar depth zones in any case, but that might not be the case, because at this time there was a lot of diversification going on, and there may have been a lot of specialization of certain species to particular types of environment which you might only get around, say, a coastline or a volcanic island system. The other thing is there might be differences in the preservation. So you can get a very different appearance of the fossil record depending on the chemistry and the physical environment that led to the fossilization of these animals. There will be differences, but we're going to need to have a close look to find out exactly how different it is. Okay, so I have a random slab under here for the moment. There are lots of them, and they all look pretty much like this. We've got these sort of green siltstone, mudstone layers, which are then coloured on the surfaces. Any fracture planes are stained orange, and that will be iron oxides resulting from probably pyrite inside the rock that's being weathered and oxidised and then coming out and leaving a thin film of oxides everywhere. It's gone rusty, basically. But the rock itself is this green material, which have these occasional layers which are covered in little fossil fragments. And it's those that, of course, that we're interested in. So I'll just turn the video on for the microscope. We're away. So yes, this is, as soon as you sort of put this under the scope, you can see it's covered in lots and lots and lots of bits of fossils. Some of them absolutely stunning. And we will come back to various bits of this any moment. We'll go through what there is in here in detail. But the first thing to say is that these are fragments. They're not entire fossils. They're not complete trilobites, for example. They're not complete crinoids. But they are pieces of larger organisms. Some of them are quite big pieces, and some of them are really beautifully preserved. I mean, that's lovely. Some of you probably won't have a clue what that is, but we'll come on to that in a bit. But you can see this surface is really densely covered by large numbers of fossils. Some familiar, some less so. And this is what you get very typically in winnowed assemblages. So this is where the sediment has been washed around for a while on the sea floor, and the fine particles have been washed away, but the current wasn't strong enough to move the larger particles. So you end up with dense concentration layers of, in some cases, sand, and in other cases, fossils, or bits of fossils. These are all on the scale of a few millimeters. They're mostly quite small things, and they've all been concentrated in these horizons. Now, they can't have been washed around for enormous lengths of time because some of these are quite delicate things which are preserved very nicely indeed. Now, of course, I can't find the delicate things that I wanted to. Ooh, that's an interesting one, isn't it? What's going on there? Ooh, I like that. Yeah, very different. Okay, come back to that as well. There are bits like these branching structures. These are bryozoans, for those who know about those things, and they are quite delicate. They're multi-branched colonies, but these are pieces of the colony, but they're quite big pieces. And a lot of the smaller fossils are, in some cases, broken, but there's quite large chunks of them are still intact, including spines coming off the corner. So there's a lot here. There's a lot of very delicate things there, but they are broken up. And everything that I'm seeing had a skeleton of calcite. There are some exceptions we'll come back to in a bit, but calcite, calcium carbonate, the more robust form of calcium carbonate. So aragonite is also calcium carbonate, and mollusks, for example, tend to have a skeleton made of aragonite. And I'm not seeing mollusks as I'm looking around. I'm mostly seeing things with a calcite skeleton, so trilobites, bryozoans, crinoids, ostracodes, and various other stuff. And that suggests that there's been quite a lot of dissolution potentially, and what you're left with are just the calcite, which is, or rather the impressions of the calcite fossils. So they were buried inside the mud as intact skeletons, or bits of skeleton, made of their original biomineral, the calcium carbonate, and then at some point that has been dissolved out. So all the calcite is gone, but we're left with these beautifully detailed impressions of the surfaces of these organisms. That is almost entirely what's going on, but then you get the odd specimen like this, which is absolutely gorgeous. Now here we've got part of a bryozoan. Again, I'll come on to what bryozoans are for those who need a recap. But it's part of a skeleton where, rather than being the calcite preserved, we have an infill of what looks like chalcedony. I think this is silica, basically cryptocrystalline quartz, almost sort of glassy. So the crystals on such a small scale that they don't really become visible as crystals. We have this almost microscopic level of detail of quartz that was infilling some of those chambers. And if that's the case, what are those lines? Interesting. Gonna have to think about this one a bit, because that preservation is difficult to explain immediately. It looks like there is a structure there. Oh, it could be sort of hoods over the surfaces. So bryozoans quite often have a sort of membranous structure which covers the little tubes. I need to remind you what bryozoans are, don't I? Because some of you probably haven't seen this entire introductory video on them. So they are translated as moss animals. They're colonial things, little lophophorites. So they are related to brachiopods and things like that, for those who know brachiopods. Lamp shells. They're little filter-feeding animals, in brachiopods' case with a couple of shells, so a bit like a bivalve, but with shells top and bottom rather than side to side. And in bryozoans, they are colonial, so you have a dense mass of tubes effectively forming a massive colony, and inside each of the little tubes there lived an animal. There are many different types of bryozoans out there, and for example, this is another bryozoan, and those little rods inside there are the infills of the tubes. They're sediment infills going into the tubaria, the zoecia, as they were. So the little animals would have been inside where the rods now are, which are infilling it. And the space is where the calcium carbonate skeleton was. So you're seeing an inverse of the original skeleton. And there are actually quite a lot of different bryozoans on this surface. That's another one which is really rather lovely. Here we're seeing an impression of this linear ornament all over the outside surface of the colony, which is really gorgeous. And then you've got these sort of oval shapes are the openings of the tubes, the zoecia. But in some cases, the tubes had a covering over the surface. There we go. Which was probably organic, I think, in many cases, maybe very thin calcium carbonate, something like that. And that sort of covering forms a sort of hood, which then leaves a little opening for the animal to poke its little tentacles out of. And is that what's going on here? Or is that silicification of internal structures where the outer part of the tube is actually on the surface that's in the shadow there underneath? It could be silicification of the sort of the hood covering the surface of the zoecia, or it could be some sort of internal part of the skeleton which left a self-contained hollow that was sealed off by the animals and then has been left infilled by the silica later. I'm not totally sure. We'll hopefully see more of this sort of thing and be able to work it out, but that is a really lovely fossil. And you'll notice immediately that there are lots and lots of different species of bryozoans here. That's another one, very irregular arrangement of tubes, pores on the surface. Well, that's quite nice. That might be something with what we call monticules, little mounds on the surface, where you can see those sort of almost radiating arrays from the polygonal shape of the openings moves out from there. Could be. Okay, we could spend a long time looking at the bryozoans and trying to work out how many species there were and possibly what they were. But I will say straight away that putting a name on bryozoans in this type of preservation is an absolute nightmare, because the taxonomy is done not on the basis of the external form or the ornament on the surface, but on the internal structure of the calcite skeleton. So they are studied by thin sections. You'd take a three-dimensionally preserved calcite skeleton and then you section it vertically and transversely, and you look at the detail within the walls of the skeleton. And so almost all of bryozoan taxonomy from this time has been done in that way, because that's where most of the fine detail is preserved. And so if you want to get a name on some of these, you have to be extremely lucky in being able somehow to tie in the structures that are visible in the molds with a species that has been named from the internal structure. And as far as I'm aware, that is probably not going to be possible to do. unless we have internal structures that can be studied in a very similar way. Maybe some limestone concretions or something like that, where from the same deposit, where you can actually tie in ones in 3D with the calcite to the ones that are preserved in the same beds based on the colony form and so on. So it's going to be really hard, but this is diverse. I mean, in my initial look around, I was seeing probably 10 species plus without really trying too hard. So I think there are many, many bryozoan species here. But of course, it's not just bryozoans. There are also brachiopods. There was one around here somewhere. There we go. There's a bit of one. Okay, that's not the most exciting looking a fossil, but that little ridged thing there is a little brachiopod, or part of a shell. So this is something that has been washed around enough that the shell has been broken. And they're quite delicate things, so it's not too surprising, but we've only got a small piece of it there. Now, there are other brachiopods on these slabs, not a huge number of them, and not a huge diversity, as far as I can see. But again, brachiopods can be quite tricky, and you do need quite nice internal structures of the impressions of the muscle scars on the inside of the shell, for example. So brachiopods are not an easy group to study, although when you get them nice intact fossils that are sort of not overlying everything else, then you can use general guidebooks to work out what you've got. There's other bits of brachiopod there, for example. I think that's, no, that's not brachiopod, that's a bit of trilobite, I think. We've also got these circular structures with a hole in the middle. Those, as again some of our long-term viewers will know, are crinoid ossicles. They are the individual components, sort of polo mint shaped things that form the column of a crinoid, which would then have a little body and branched arms coming out the top with filter feeding arrays coming off them. So mostly what you find with crinoids, because they're quite delicate animals, are the individual sclerites, the individual components of the skeleton, which are particularly the columnals, because you get hundreds of them in a long column. And this is a couple of examples of that. Probably the same species, but top and bottom surface of one of those ossicles, I think. I have again seen a diversity of these in the quick look I've had, and it looks like there were significant numbers of crinoids. But when you think how many ossicles a single crinoid individual will break down into, we're talking hundreds, and how many we're seeing on the surfaces of these slabs, which is not that many, then, well, they clearly were not a major component of this fauna. And you can see there are a reasonable number of them scattered around. There's a few there as well. But in terms of the numbers of individuals, compare that with, say, the brachiopods. A single shell is a single individual produces two shells. And in this case, we have a single individual in crinoids producing hundreds of ossicles. So you have to divide by hundreds in order to get an appropriate sort of estimate for the abundance. So the crinoids were quite scarce. Another thing that we're seeing quite a bit of here is stuff like that. And isn't that lovely? Some of you, I'm sure, will know what that is. It is the genal angle of a trilobite. So Ordovician was one of the main times for trilobite diversity. There were huge numbers of species inhabiting almost all marine environments. And one of the major groups of trilobites were the trinucleids. Now, these are an extremely distinctive group of organisms and fossils. They only lived during the Ordovician, they died out at the end of it. But we have a strange arrangement where they've lost their eyes. They were completely blind, despite, like this one, living in quite shallow water, where there would have been light. So they would have been at a disadvantage. But instead of eyes, they have a weird structure around the front of the head. Now, we do have a complete specimen of a cephalon, which I'll just dig out for you so we can show you properly. This is a complete one that Andy kindly put aside for me. Well, I say complete, it's a nearly complete cephalon. This is, if you like, the head of a trilobite. It's actually not the head, because this lump in the middle, called the glabella, is where the stomach was. So unless you keep your stomach in your head, it's not a head. Anyway, it has this arrangement of pits covering the edges and the front and the sides of the cephalon. And it's a really interesting structure, because we don't know exactly what it was for. There are lots of ideas. I've seen it suggested that this was a sort of a sieve, effectively. This was a paper by Forty and Owens, where they suggested that it was actually using this to push water through and filter out food particles, which it then shoved up into its mouth. However, in some cases at least, these pores don't seem to have gone all the way through, and mechanically it doesn't make a lot of sense, because forcing water through tiny holes is not that easy and very prone to being clogged by fine particles. So to me, I don't buy that. I prefer the idea that this was a sensory system, that you can imagine these things having either chemical sensors or tiny little hairs inside these pits. And then when the water is moving around them, they can detect changes in the water on quite a sophisticated level, because you just have one hair wired up to a nerve that tells you when the hair moves that the water has moved. If you have two hairs and then one moves and then the other does, then you know which direction the water is moving. If you have a dense array of hairs covering a two-dimensional surface all around the front of the head, then you can potentially tell not only which direction the water is moving, but what shape of object is causing the water to move, and whether that object itself is moving, and if so, whether it's likely to be hungry. So this is potentially, depending on how the signals coming from little hairs in those pits were wired into its brain and how that translates into its sort of conscious awareness of an object around it, depending on all that, it could potentially be a replacement for a visual system. It might be able to show water movement even some distance away. So large objects moving a long way away would give you a different pattern to a small object moving close by. It might be a really good defensive and potentially offensive character as well, if you're looking for tiny little worms or something to snuffle up to. So these are trinucleids. They are lovely, lovely little fossils, and this is a thing called Saltolithus. Not sure the species. There is a Harnagensis, which it might well be. I haven't looked into the details. It's a Saltolithus. And there are papers on these showing that there's one species in particular which then actually diversified into several other types of Saltolithus and Brachiopods, which shows that at this time there was a lot of diversification going on within the group. And we don't have Saltolithus in the built-in layer. We have other trinucleids, but we don't see this one. We don't see any of this complex of species. Now, that could be because they didn't evolve until that interval of 1 million years between the built-in layer and here, or it could be that we just haven't found them because it's a different environment. But in any case, this is a new trilobite to me, so it's really nice to see it. Right, but there's more to this, I can show you. Loads more things here than just trinucleids, and bryozoans, and brachiopods. What else we got? Well, the other really obvious thing is an array of little lumpy fossils, which are fairly small. Where are we? Oh, there's one there. Let's zoom in on that, shall we? There we go. Little sort of pill-shaped thing with a couple of lumps and a sulcus between them, a little sort of groove, and then a flange going round the outside on the lower edge. Yeah, that is an odd thing, is it not? For those who are not familiar with them, this could be completely baffling. But this is one of a pair of shells, but not made by a mollusk or a brachiopod. It is one of a pair of shells owned by an ostracod, a crustacean. They're also called seed shrimps, I think sometimes, common name, but ostracods are how you'll normally find them. And they had a calcite shell, and still do. There are many ostracods around today, and if you look in a drop of pond water, you'll probably find ostracods, particularly living amongst the weed and the algae on the bottom of the pond, if you can actually find a pond that still has water in Wales at the moment, because not many of them do. But anyway, in most cases, you will find ostracods very, very commonly. They'll just be in puddles that are semi-permanent in the summer and well, all over the place. But that is another ostracod there. Can't really turn it around because the rock's too big and it won't fit on the stage then. But that is not a very good one. Let me find a better one. Oh, there's another one. That was the same sort as the one we just seen. And then there's this sort of rather simpler, sort of smooth oval thing there without any ridges on it. There are... Oh, that's a nice one. Yeah. Hang on, I can change the whole thing round. Yeah, if I move the stage as well, I can show you that. This is also an ostracod. It's one of the group called the tetradellines, and the taxonomy of these things can be quite challenging, but they're called tetradellines because they've got basically 4 lobes, which are joined by these little thin ridges. And there are all sorts of variations on these things. There are ones with beautiful ornament on the outside, little spikes and flanges. There are some where one of these lobes sort of sticks up above the end and turns into a sort of wavy hand-like thing. It's a bit weird. Ceratopsis, that one is. And you get quite a high diversity of them in general, and they have been used for biostratigraphy at times. They're quite useful things, and they're not normally very diverse within any one assemblage, at least in the Ordovician, in my experience. I have found a few exceptions. There are 1 or 2 sites we have in the Middle Ordovician where, if you put a lot of work in, you can start to put together a faunal list of 10, potentially 20 species. There's actually a lot of them here. And hardly any of them have been described in that. But there is a monograph of the Ordovician Llandeilo and Caraddoc, so the same age as we're looking at here, Beiviciocope ostracods from England and Wales. So it's not all the ostracods, it's all the types that look like this. And this is a 2-volume work from 1986 to 97 by C.R. Jones. And yeah, there is a diversity of ostracods to choose from. There's quite a few of these tetradellines, as you can see, same sort of idea, but there's a lot of subtlety in the form and variation of them. There are also a 2nd volume of Binodicopes, which have a different sort of arrangement with 2 sort of lobes on them. Again, you get the idea. Oh, that looks vaguely familiar. In fact, that's very familiar. This one here is probably poorly preserved examples in the middle here of the same species we were looking at just now with that little groove in the top. So we think that is going to be Ulrichia bicornis. Maybe. Either that or a close relative. The problem is that these specimens in the monograph are not as good. We're not seeing the detail of that tuberculate sort of outer surface. So it may be that it's a slightly different one and we'd have to dig into the literature quite a lot more to find out. But there are a lot of ostracod species in total. But that is for the much wider time interval, sort of 7 or 8 million years, I think it is, the Llandeilo and Caraddoc of England and Wales. So that covers quite a wide interval and a wide area. And normally you'd expect to get, if you're lucky, 2 or 3 nice little ostracod species in a fauna. And already we've seen 3 just with that quick scan. And I can assure you there are a lot more. They are amazing things in terms of the detail as well. So that one is an internal mould. So that's the impression of the inside of the shell, which doesn't show where the ornament is on the outside. But I'm sure we can find another one. Maybe I have to go to a different slab for that. But while we're here, I just want to go back to this bryozoan because it's rather lovely. Here we have these little tubes sticking in. Those little rods pointing up towards us at an angle, those are the infills of the zoecia. So those little tiny dots between them are spikes. They are projecting outwards into the sediment. Those are little spines, which is a feature I am not used to seeing in these Ordovician bryozoans. I'm not sure what that thing is, but it's really interesting, and I will have to get a photo of it. As I say, this is just a single slab out of a box full, and there's a lot more variation to look at. So I think I'll, rather than spending all the time on this one, oh, there's another nice ostracod. That is another tetradelline. Oh, look at that. It's another tetradelline, but it is a different one. It doesn't have the sharp ridges, but it's got this wonderful ornament. And that's actually, is that an internal surface again? Excuse me a moment, got to squint at it. That is still an internal mould. So I dread to think what the outside was like, but that is detail where it's normally quite smooth on the inner surface. Oh, isn't that lovely? Those may well be pores, the bases of puncti, little tubes running through the shell. And if we can see the outer margin in cross-section there, doesn't seem to have much in the way of spines, but there are definitely little tubercles and bobbles along the edge. So that would have been a very lumpy ostracod. Anyway, what was I saying? Yes, there must be lots of other things, and let's have a look at some other slabs. I could spend hours and hours just going through this one, but I don't want to put it away. Right, let's find another one. All right, we've got one here that I haven't looked at all before, so I have no idea what's going to be on it. Let's find out. Okay, at first glance, we have bryozoans. Lots and lots of bryozoans there. Radial one. What? Oh, that's a bit of a trinucleate. Oh, what is that? Yeah, it is a little bit of the trinucleate fringe again. Crinoid ossicles, more columnals, more bryozoans. Bryozoans everywhere. Yet more bryozoans. Okay, and more bryozoans. How many different bryozoans are there just in this area? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's a different shape. I would guess 6 or 7 just in that tiny little area there, which is quite impressive, really. Ooh, a nice ostracod. I think that might be a different one again. This is the way that the fourth ridge, the one on the right in this orientation, is so faint compared with the other three. I think that's something different again. What else we got? There's another, this very common ostracod, the probable Ulrichia bicornis. Ooh, hello, what are you? That's a strange thing. Very finely porous. I am wondering at things like a bit of a plate from an echinoderm, because they can have a very porous structure, or possibly something like trilobite. Excuse me a moment, I'm just going to have to look at this with both eyes. Yep, trilobite. This is, it's much easier to see when you can get it in 3 dimensions, but those are actually not pores, but the impressions of tiny little tubercles or spines on the surface. And that's probably going to be quite an highly ornamented trilobite. I'm guessing something like odontopleurid, which are lovely spiky things. And you can just about make out this is part of the cranidium, the middle of the cephalon, the head, if you like, if you must. But this is, yeah, something different. It's a different trilobite to the trinucleids, certainly. Okay, more bryozoans everywhere. Ooh, more bryozoans. It's bryozoan paradise, isn't it? And ostracod. Oh, a little brachiopod. Oh, that's nice. Yeah, you can see it's got these very strong radial ridges and also concentric growth lines that are leaving little steps in the shell. So those little sort of ridges going around concentrically are growth lines. And I think that has to be something like Glyptorthis, which is a genus we have in the built-in layer. And we know actually from the environments that we find Glyptorthis in that it's consistent within a certain type of water depth. And that water depth is also where we get the peak in the abundance of ostracods. So this is nice. I suspect this is showing some sort of ecological continuity, a pattern which is similar to what we see in the built-in layer. In fact, there's another video where I was talking about life in an Ordovician lagoon where we did find quite a lot of Glyptorthis. And can't remember if there were any ostracods in that one actually. But it's that sort of environment where we do get ostracods in other sites as well. So I think that might be a bit of continuity. We've got relatively quiet water, but shallow. Nice. So we then have lots more bits of trilobite, more ostracods, different ones again maybe, little smooth ones, baked beans we tend to call them. Yeah, working out the actual taxonomy of them beyond baked bean is quite tricky at times, but we do our best sometimes. And yeah, there's a lot here. More little ostracods. More. You can see it is dominantly bryozoans, ostracods, and occasional crinoid fragments and brachiopod bits, and trilobite bits as well. But really, in terms of abundance, it's the ostracods and bryozoans that are winning the competition at this point. You can spend so long just trying to work out what there is and just admiring the beauty of the thing, because it's really rather lovely. Oh, some more silicification going on there. Yeah, this sort of grey, almost glassy-like material is chalcedony again. So we're getting, I think, silica infill of some of these colonies. Yeah, just in isolated pockets. So there must have been some silica dissolved in the water, some dissolved quartz effectively, or silicic acid, which could then precipitate quite early, before dissolution of the skeletons anyway, inside the spaces within the skeletons. Oh, that's a lovely one. Another ostracod. Again, it's something different, I think. Really beautiful little sort of tuberculate or spiny outside surface. Yeah, that's nice. Now here we got something different. That black material will be carbon. Is there anything we can get out of that? At a guess? No. It's really bad preservation of something, but that was organic, carbonaceous material. Maybe a fragment of graptolite or something like that, maybe a bit of arthropod, possibly even something softer like seaweed, but I don't think we'll be able to see anything useful in that bit. And that is just the way it goes. You get little scraps of organic stuff which don't show any of the original structure at all. Okay, not bad. Well, let's have a quick look around and see if I've missed anything. Another rather lovely bryozoan here. That's got a lot of continuous tubes, so rather than being broken up by little septi, sort of plates that separate different bits of the skeleton, this has got sediment infill going all the way down the tube, so there must have been mostly open, and that would be a useful feature if you were doing taxonomy on them. Anyone feel like a challenge? No? Well, I'll carry on then. Alrighty, what's that? It's the external impression of probably a different bryozoan again, with individual tubes. It's a very slender branch. This is quite small. I've zoomed in a bit there. And you can see, yes, if those little projections on the side were the openings of individual tubes, that would fit in size for bryozoan. So that's probably a very different type of bryozoan. Might be a cryptostome or something like that. Nice. More ostracodes. You get the idea. I'm probably going to go on to another block now, because I know... Oh, hello! Just as I was about to give up hope. That is something different. You can see initially that the colour is different. This is a sort of bluey grey colour, and it's a conical shape with lines down it. Now that's really rather nice. That colouring is typical of calcium phosphate, which is a sort of material that makes your teeth and bones and the shells of some animals like the lingulate brachiopods. But that is not a brachiopod. That, if we zoom in on this, is almost certainly going to have quite a nice structure of little lines or tubercles or something going across the surface. Where is it? Come on. Oh, not seeing it yet. Okay. Oh, no. It's there, but it's pretty faint. Yes, okay. Let me change the lighting a little bit. Make it from one direction only. Yeah, you can see the surface has got lines of lumps going across it. They're really quite obscure. I was expecting them to be much sharper, more sharply defined than that. Maybe on the other side? Yeah, again, not really clear at all. But the shape of this and those ridges going up the side are dead giveaway. That is a conulariid. And these are a group I've got a little video on if you've never come across them. They're a lovely group of fossils which are believed to be effectively jellyfish or very close relatives of them, which lived on the seafloor. They were benthic, living inside this sort of pyramidal, four-sided, pyramid-shaped rather than conical, although sometimes it was rounded and more conical, sort of cone-shaped shell of calcium phosphate. And that is, I think, what we are seeing there. I'll just put in the cross polarizer, see if that makes any difference to the structure. We can maybe see a little bit more there, but not a huge amount. But no, those ridges going up the sides are called carini, and that will be a little conulariid, but not one that I'm immediately familiar with. That is really nice. Conulariids are not abundant fossils. They are locally common. You do get them sometimes, but they are not the sort of thing that you ever expect to find, with very few exceptions. There are a few localities where you can pretty reliably stumble across a conulariid, but mostly you're not going to see them. Nice. Okay, time to move on to another slab maybe. There's still always more to look at, more bryozoans. Oh, that's a trilobite rib in cross-section. Very characteristic, sort of two straight sides interrupted by a lobe in the middle, sort of rounded one. So that's a thoracic rib of probably trinucleid. It looks like a trinucleid type to me. So that'll be almost certainly the Salterilithus again. Yeah. Impressive masses of stuff. But again, it's still mostly bryozoans and ostracods. Let's see if it changes when we go to a different slab. Okay, I do want to show you this one, because this is another one that Andy put to one side for me. and it is absolutely gorgeous. Have a look at this with the microscope. It's not something new for us. It is a bryozoan, but look at this. That is just ridiculously stunning. And you've got the detail of the ornament of the surface with these little ridges running out from the side. You've got the arrangement of these we see with different sizes, in fact. That's quite interesting. And this has got to be a distinctive species, but I don't know if anyone has ever tried to describe these sort of molds of bryozoans before from this area. I have to go back to the really old monographs to try to make sense of it, but it's a lovely, lovely thing. And it's quite a delicate sort of bladed sheet-like skeleton with branches. So that's a nice example. And actually there's a different species there as well, the very slender one between them. You could just spend hours poring over specimens like that and seeing what you can get out of them. But there's more brachiopods. That's a different one there. Quite slender ribs and ones that divide. There are obviously more bryozoans because there are always more bryozoans. And there are ostracodes. Of course, there are little ostracodes there. Yet more bryozoans. Oh, hello. Yes, that's what we want. I'll put the light on full again. That is a Librigina of the cheek of a trilobite called an odontopleurid. And it looks to me like a primaspis or something like that. And there is a primaspis harnagensis. So it's quite possible that this is that species. And you can see this array of spines around the outside. So odontopleurids are famously spiny. They were just an order of trilobites that the entire lateral side of the surface, and sometimes the top as well, was covered in these little spines. And they're extremely distinctive. You can't really fail to identify it when you see one of these things. And even in a small fragment, you know you've got an odontopleurid. And they're not abundant trilobites. They are locally common. In the Silurian, we tend to get them more frequently. In the Ordovician, they are generally very rare things where we are in the built-in layer. There are, I think, several species known from a single fragment of a specimen. Then there's one species that dominates a long stream section. That's a bit weird. But this one is obviously, this is the second bit of it that we've now found, not that rare, but it wasn't as common as the trinucleids, and certainly nothing like as common as the bryozoans and the ostracods. This is a little community that really does seem to be dominated by the bryozoans, and then there were various other things living alongside them. More little ostracods, more bryozoans. That's a different bit of trilobite. I'm not sure what that one would be. That's something larger. Yeah, I wouldn't like to say on that one. Something with a little sort of slightly tuberculate texture, but that doesn't narrow it down much. Nice brachiopod there. Really nice brachiopod. And another one. And more brachiopods. So there are a few brachiopods at this level. Crinoid ossicle there. Not a very exciting one, but it's there. And yeah, there's definitely all sorts of bits and pieces. Quite a lot. Oh, different brachiopod. Oh, that's nice. Yeah, some very strong ridges. Triplesia or something like that, maybe. I'm not sure. I don't know my brachiopods all that well. I did spot earlier on, though, a different brachiopod, which I'll just try to find. Okay, I can see it again. It was right down here on the edge. There we go. That is another brachiopod, but this one has a phosphatic shell, hence this sort of bluey grey colouring of a little bit of the shell is left there, that little piece of it. But then you've got this weird shell shape in which the umbo is in the middle, and you've got concentric growth lines, as in all the way round. So this became more like a sort of limpet, if you like. It's sort of a hat-shaped thing that just sort of kept growing. And this is probably a patravula or a schizotreata, something like that. I'd have to go back to the books to try to work it out. But it's one of a group of phosphatic lingulate brachiopods, which is quite different to the other ones. Okay, what else was there? Okay. Now here is another conulariid. You can see it's mostly just an impression. The counterpart, which probably Andy has somewhere, will have the rest of it on. But it has those carini running down it. But here you can see very strongly that fine ornament of little tubercles going in lines across the surface. So you know what? I think that's a different conulariid. I think we've got two species of conulariids here. And that is a novelty. You hardly ever get multiple species of conulariid, at least in my experience. Castlebank, I think we have. Actually, there we've got several, but that's really unusual. And here it looks like we've got a second species of conulariid with really nice detailed ornament, those little nodes running across it in an interesting array of little ridges. And yeah, I like that. Okay, conulariid, perfect. Let's see what else I can find you. Okay, yet another different bryozoan, which is really elegant, sort of internal structure there, and these sort of straight tubes going out at an angle. And next to it is another different ostracod, with that sort of groove down the middle. That's rather nice as well. Yeah, there's a lot in here. There really is. That is part of a single thoracic rib of that odontopleurid. So where it bends down on the right, that is actually a spine projecting backwards from the side of the body. And then you've got little spines sticking up, which are those little dots that you can see along the upper margin. So those would be sticking out from the carapace as well. Yeah, it's quite an impressive thing, but there's clearly odontopleuroids there. Oh, right. There are quite a few things that I haven't actually shown you because I found them when I was looking earlier and I haven't been able to relocate them again. So it included this rather interesting little plate from a thing called a machaeridian. Now this is, like conulariid, something you hardly ever actually stumble across, but this is a plate from an armoured worm. They were long very enigmatic until a complete specimen turned up in Morocco with the soft tissue and the plate array, with the plates partly pulled off so you can actually see the internal soft tissues as well. So that was first real evidence of what these things were, and it turns out these little plates like that are part of the skeleton, the armouring of a polychaete annelid worm. So again, it's not something you necessarily expect to see, but it's lovely when they appear. And there's a lot more where that came from. There are a lot of, well, there are at least some blocks that I haven't even looked at yet. I mean, I just unwrapped this one, and it's got a little conulariid right in the middle, rather a nice one, and up here there is a little graptolite. And there's doubtless yet more things that I haven't seen. And for example, there's a little trilobite pygidium there, a little the sort of tail section, if you like, from one of these trinucleids, the Saltarolithus, and that seems to have little things on the surface. Some little circles which might just be crinoid ossicles that were resting on the surface when it was fossilised, but then there's a little sort of networky bryozoan thing, which I think is an encruster. I think that's an impression of a bryozoan that was living attached to this bit of trilobite, which is rather nice. It's another level of the ecology. So how much of this would already have been described? Are there any new species here likely? Well, it depends on the group. So the trilobites and the brachiopods and the graptolites, they would all almost certainly have been described. You might get really lucky and find something new, but the chances are everything has been monographed in the 1800s up to the 1960s, 70s, 80s, there was a lot of taxonomic work focused in this area, and I would imagine that everything we've looked at has already been described in that way. But for the other groups, it gets less certain. So the ostracodes, I think there's at least half a dozen species that don't seem to be in here from just having had a quick look through. And I dare say there are other papers, book chapters and things like that where other ostracods from this area have been reported or described from elsewhere in the world. So it's quite likely that most of them, probably not all, but most of them have been described to some extent. Then there are things like the bryozoans, where the problem is the preservation, because they may have been described, but we don't know. That said, limestone habitats, environments, tend to be a slightly different ecology from the things living in sandstones and siltstone, so I would say, also based on what we see in the Bill Thin layer, there's a high chance that a decent proportion, maybe more than half, of the bryozoans in these rocks are new species. It would be almost impossible to describe them taxonomically and give them names, but they probably are ones that are not already known in the literature. The conulariids and machaeridians, who knows? You'd have to go digging a bit, see whether they were included. For example, Ida Slater had a monograph in 1907 on the conulariids of the UK, so it may be that it's included in there. We'd have to check that. There haven't been many papers on them since, and hardly anything on machaeridians. So it would be a question of just checking what has been published. But I'd give them a 50-50 chance of having been described before. There are clearly quite a few of them here. I mean, that's 3 or 4 conulariids we've seen in the blocks we've looked at, which is quite good going. They're not that common generally. And then there are other things that we've seen that I'm not quite sure what to make of, little slightly wrinkled sheets. Probably they also are not going to be definable. They might be sort of fragments of crunchy arthropod, but not mineralized, so tough chitinous cuticle, something like that. There just isn't enough information to go on. But the beauty of a fauna like this is not really in the possibility of new species. It's in the ecology and just a lovely preservation, because the detail in these things is absolutely stunning. The ostracods and the bryozoans I'm seriously impressed by. You hope for this sort of level of detail, but most sites you don't really get it. So this is really lovely preservation. And it is telling us about a community which is interesting ecologically. Now, the problem is, as I was saying at the beginning, we don't really know how representative of a real community this is. Because on the one hand, these are winnowed slabs. These have been mixed together, they have been washed around for a while, and the fossils of a relatively similar size have ended up deposited together in one plane. And that can mean that there has been a lot of movement, of mixing of communities that were living in very different places, and you just end up with a mass of fragments in one area when they were actually living miles away. Countering that, though, is the fact that we have some really nice preservation of a lot of the bryozoans especially, and the fact that we also do not see dominance of brachiopod fragments. There are some, there are quite a few brachiopods here, but it's not dominated by fragmented brachiopods. And most of what we're seeing is not intact, but not finely broken up. So I've seen lots of rocks around this area in transported sort of storm bed deposits where it's mostly fragments of shells which are indeterminable. Here, there's a lot more that is determinable. There's a lot of really nice preservation, which means it hasn't been washed around for too long, and probably this is representing a community that was not in situ and not a very tightly enclosed ecosystem, but something which was representing a community that was generally living together, which is nice. And one thing that is immediately so striking about this whole fossil assemblage is the dominance of these diverse bryozoans and diverse ostracods. You've got a few species of trilobite there, mostly pieces of Salterilithus, but also the Pseudontoplurid. And you've got various brachiopods. Now, the brachiopods need, well, some of them, the sort of ridged ones, not the phosphatic ones, need a hard surface to attach to normally. The phosphatic ones were more sort of burrowers or limpet-like things. Not really limpet-like because they got two shells, but they were sort of lying sort of flat on the seafloor or burrowing. So there's a bit of a mixture of ecology there. But we're seeing this enormous range of bryozoans and ostracods. And I like that as a combination. We see it elsewhere. We've seen it at some levels in moderately shallow water in the built-in layer. And there are water depths at which we get diverse, delicate bryozoans. And I think that's what we're seeing here. This was an ecosystem in which bryozoans constructed the ecology. They were the framework of the ecosystem, if you like. The ostracods, because the bryozoans are small, the things living amongst them would also tend to be small. Compare it with a kelp forest and it's on, meters and tens of meters scale. These bryozoans were looking at animal colonies that sort of size. And the things living amongst the branches and between the stalks, finding shelter amongst them, would also need to be generally quite small, which fits with diverse ostracod community. The trilobites and things like that would probably be living also amongst the larger bits or around the edges of these little bryozoan thickets. And so you can gradually piece together this idea of an ecosystem on a shallow seafloor, maybe quite a protected area because these are quite delicate fossils. And so you probably got episodic water movement, maybe during storms or something like that, where it gets a little bit more violent and the waves were more active, which then rip up and break up these fragments of bryozoans, which were living probably forming a sort of a seafloor forest. And it's really lovely to see this sort of ecosystem developing because we don't really see it until now. In the Middle Ordovician, in the built-in layer, we get much more brachiopod dominated with quite a few bryozoans, but not to the same extent as here. Likewise, the ostracods. Crinoids also tended to be a larger proportion of the fauna in the built-in layer at this equivalent sort of depth than they seem to be here. So I suspect what we're looking at is a modification of the ecosystem we see at Bilth into something which is much more like a bryozoan thicket, similar to what we see today. If you look on the roots, the holdfasts of large seaweeds, often you have dense colonies of bryozoans and lots of tiny things, including little brachiopods, well, sometimes actually, but mostly little bivalves living amongst them. Now, we are not seeing the whole ecosystem, obviously, because everything we've got here is made of calcite. We're not, or beta phosphate. We're not seeing anything soft-bodied. We're not even seeing the little chitinous arthropods. And one thing that is really striking, of course, you've all spotted this, there are no sponges. I haven't seen a single spicule. I haven't seen a lithistid sponge, a massive skeleton or anything like that, which would be more preservable, but individual spicules with this level of preservation, you would really hope to be here. In the built-in layer, there are sponge spicules everywhere. Environments of this depth, sponges would be one of the most common types of fossils. So where are they? Is it because they weren't living here, or is it because they weren't preserved? My guess is on the latter. Because sponges, their skeletons are made, for the most part, of silica. And that silica, opal, is actually quite soluble in warm, shallow water. It tends to be unsaturated, the water, with respect to silicic acid, so you end up with opal dissolving very rapidly and leaving things like calcium carbonate to dissolve much more slowly. So we may have found that this was actually full of siliceous sponges, and they have left no trace. But in the Bill Thin Layer, because it was a volcanic island system with masses of rhyolites and andesites, lots of silica in the water, that sort of buffered the saturation state, and you end up with silica not dissolving rapidly because there was so much silica already dissolved in the water. So I find it hard to believe, given how sponges are so abundant and so diverse in the Bill Thin Layer, that I find it hard to believe that they wouldn't have been here as well. And this is one of these large-scale biases that you can sometimes get in the fossil record that can completely shift what you seem to be seeing. Of course, it's possible that they weren't there ecologically, but if you look at modern bryozoan-dominated environments today, these holdfasts on kelp and so on, there are numerous little demosponges growing amongst the bases of the bryozoans, overgrowing them and forming a dense, tangled sort of mesh of them. So I find it hard to believe that wasn't the case at this point. But you can't prove it. This is based on understanding of how ecology worked in the Ordovician and understanding of the vagaries of the fossil record. What else is there that could possibly be missing that we might expect to see and which has a skeleton? Have you got it yet? I'll give you a second. Yeah, that's enough. Right, mollusks, obviously. Mollusks are mostly made of aragonite. Aragonite dissolves more quickly than calcite under most conditions. So at this time, you see a trend in which you get faunas that are dominated by brachiopods, shelly faunas, without any mollusks. And for a long, long time, this was considered to be just a feature of ecosystems, that mollusks didn't really get going very effectively in the Ordovician. There are bivalves and there are gastropods known, many of them, but they're not that abundant. And then there was a series of studies. Leslie Churns had a really interesting paper called Missing Mollusks, where she was looking at communities, I think it was in Scandinavia, from the Silurian, with different preservation styles, but from the same environment. So you have your normal sort of limestone or sandstone deposits. I'll have to look up the paper and check all the details. It was something like this, where you get brachiopods, you get the calcite shelled things. And then there was a silicified fauna. Rapid silicification, different chemistry, which preserved the same brachiopods, the same trilobites, the same normal calcitic fossils, and also mollusks, diverse mollusks. Bivalves, gastropods, all the rest of it, were there. They were sitting there amongst the brachiopods, they were living together, and yet normally they were not preserved because they were made of aragonite. And so we have another large-scale shift potentially in the fossilization potential of different members of the same ecosystem. And there's been a lot of work on this since then, and it's been kind of dialed back a little bit, in that there are also many assemblages where we know mollusks do preserve, and yet they are still depauperate in comparison with brachiopods and so on. So under some conditions, mollusks did preserve, but they weren't as abundant. Under some conditions, they did preserve and they were as abundant, and under many other conditions, they probably didn't preserve. And so you do get also small-scale ecological differences. So even though we're looking at similar sort of communities in this Scandinavian study, you don't know for certain that they weren't a different ecosystem, in which case one of them had mollusks and the other didn't. The general consensus now is that this is a major effect, but it's not the complete answer. That there were certainly lots of mollusks there that were preserved, but where we don't see any, you have to look at the taphonomy to try to understand whether they were likely to have been there or not. Okay, final comparison with the rough nuke fauna. This was from a very similar type of environment with not too dissimilar type of preservation. It's molds of fossils in sort of siltstone, and it was quite nice material. So the difference we will be seeing in the groups that are fossilised should be down to ecological changes between the late Ordovician and the early Silurian. And if you look at that video, the one thing that you'll see which was immediately striking is how much lower the diversity was. There was far higher dominance of a few species. I think I had 5 or 6 species of bryozoans that were turning up commonly. And here, I wouldn't like to count. There are probably dozens of bryozoan species here, and it is just a far more diverse, I wouldn't say complex because that has very different meanings in different contexts, but a much more diverse and richer community than we see in the rough nuke fauna from the early Silurian. And that, you would have to say, is probably a reflection of the end Ordovician extinction. That's what a mass extinction can do. It can turn this thriving community of huge numbers of species, and we're mostly looking at one little ecosystem here. You go to a slightly different environment in the nearby area, you'll have many different things. It can turn that into this much more depauperate fauna, which is still quite nice. I mean, things did recover after the end Ordovician, but it's nowhere near the scale of diversity that we're seeing here. And this is how paleontology works. It's not that you can draw grand conclusions from any one fauna. It's how you piece together all the lines of evidence, how you take one set of fossils and you work for years on that, building up a picture of what was living there, and do the same again a mile down the road. And it's the work cumulatively of all the people who have come before from the 1700s onwards, describing what is in the fossil record that pieces together this picture of the sheer richness of the history of life and allows us to go to something like this, compare with other faunas and say, well, yes, this was probably a sort of bryozoan thicket on the seafloor, crawling with ostracodes of diverse forms, a few little brachiopods and trilobites scuttling around the edges where they could get into the corners. And you get the idea. You can actually bring these worlds to life, not just by looking at one set of fossils, but by really understanding how the differences between ecosystems that are preserved have come about. Partly it's ecology, partly it's preservation, partly it's various other things, I'm sure, and partly it's me rambling on for well over an hour. So I'd better leave it there, but I will leave you with a smorgasbord of lots of pretty pictures from this amazing set of fossils. Thank you again to Andy for sending me this box, and if you don't mind, I won't send it back just yet because I can probably take another few hundred photos. I just want to get a really good set of images and I'll send them on to you with the photos, with the specimens. Okay, I'm frazzled. That's quite enough for me. Bye-bye for now.